I'm Jake McDowell. I work for the Portland District Corps in the Fish Passage section, and I'm here to introduce the avian predation management session. And as you can all tell from your programs, I know you're all looking at your programs, seeing when we're going to go out to the bars, but we have 4 talks ahead of us, addressing 6 different RPAs from the 2008 and 2010, 2014 buyout. I've color-coded the talks here so that you can see where we're going. We're going to start with the green team of Dr. Roby, and he's going to be talking about the implementation of the Caspian Tern Management Plan in 2018 under RPA 45, and he's also going to be talking about the monitoring of the Caspian terns in the estuary under RPA 66. And a little bit into the effectiveness of the Caspian Tern Management Plan. Then we're gonna switch gears to cormorants and bring in the orange team of Chris Lightner and Aaron Turecek, and they're going to talk about the implementation of the double-crested cormorant management plan in the estuary in 2018. And our monitoring of the cormorant population in the estuary. And then the next set of talks is going to be Dave Trachtenberg and Ken Collis, and they're going to talk about the inland avian management plan under RPA 47, and monitoring of the avian predators on the Columbia Plateau under RPA 68. And then coming in to sweep up the pit tags when we're all done is Alan Evans, who's going to talk about impacts of all of these avian species on salmonids and what he's found out from pit tag recoveries this year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dan and have him talk about Caspian terns.
Okay, thank you, Jake. I'm going to start out, as Jake mentioned, talking about the Caspian Tern Management Plan for the Columbia River Estuary, which is focused, my work at least, is focused on the Caspian Tern colony on East Sand Island, which is at river kilometer 8 in the Columbia River Estuary. And this is going to be a quick overview of 2018 results from our monitoring efforts, collaboration between Oregon State University Real-Time Research in Bend and the USGS Oregon Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. So this is how the East Sand Island tern colony looked in 2018. You can see that there's a fair number of birds on the colony, surrounded by vegetation and landscape fabric, and couple of our observation blinds in the background. This is what the habitat for Caspian terns looked like right after after creation was completed in April of 2018. This photograph, I think, was taken on the 9th of April. And I'm showing this because I want you to see where the outline in red is of the 1 acre of habitat that was provided. And that black crosshatch area in the eastern part of the photograph is new habitat that was created for Caspian terns so that they would have an acre of habitat in order to replace habitat that was washed away. Not sure this has it was washed away here along the southern edge of the colony during winter storms. So all this habitat over here was newly created using rototillers and disking of that habitat. This is a later photograph of the same colony area in 2018 with the outline of habitat that was occupied by the terns in red. each one of these red dots is an individual Caspian tern. So this was a photograph that we used in order to estimate the size of the Caspian tern colony in numbers of breeding pairs. So this histogram shows you the history of providing habitat for Caspian terns to nest on bare ground habitat on the east end of East Sand Island. Whoops. And you can see that that initially there was around 6 acres of habitat provided for them, but then starting in 2008, that area of habitat was gradually reduced until 2015, when it was reduced down to 1 acre of habitat, where it has remained for the last 4 breeding seasons. And you can also, whoops, sorry. You can also see that the acre of habitat was pretty much completely utilized in 2018, whereas in most other years there was some habitat that was provided that was not utilized. Okay, so this year, 2018, the colony size estimate for Caspian tern breeding pairs at the East Sand Island colony on that 1 acre designated habitat was very close to 5,000 breeding pairs. 4,959 pairs is our best estimate, but you can see that the 95% confidence interval extends from about 4,700 pairs to about 5,200 pairs. So this is quite a bit larger than the target colony size that was designated back in 2005 when the environmental impact statement for this management plan was initiated, and that target colony size was 3,125 breeding pairs. So there's still more breeding pairs using the acre of habitat on East Sand Island than was intended by the management plan. So this shows you the history of the colony size at East Sand Island of Caspian terns with the 95% confidence intervals. This dark solid line here indicates the pre-management average for colony size. So you can see it was about 9,400 breeding pairs, but it peaked out in 2008 at over 10,000 breeding pairs. But since then it has been gradually declining as the area of habitat was reduced starting in 2008 all the way down to 1 acre for the last 4 years. But you can see that the first year of 1 acre of habitat being provided, the colony was still slightly higher than 6,000 breeding pairs. That declined a bit in 2016. It went way down in 2017, a year when the entire colony failed to produce any young. So that was a total breeding failure in 2017. But then it popped back up in 2018. And this dashed line here shows you the target of 3,125 breeding pairs. So it got very close to that, at least the 95% confidence interval in 2017, but now it's popped back up to about 5,000 breeding pairs. Okay, so this is part of the explanation for how those changes in colony size occur, because this shows you average nesting density in nests per meter squared on the y-axis as a function of year on the x-axis. And you can see that in the 2000s, the birds were pretty spread out. They had more habitat than they really needed. So they spread themselves out on the available habitat, which was somewhere around 5 or 6 acres. But as the habitat declined, the birds increased their nesting density till it reached a peak in 2016 when it was 1.36 pairs on average per meter squared, which is the highest that we've ever seen at East Sand Island. That dropped dramatically in 2017, last year when the colony completely failed, but then it jumped back up significantly in 2018, so that in 2018 it was intermediate in size between, or intermediate in nesting density between the very high densities in 2016 and the much lower densities in 2017. In addition to monitoring the size of the Caspian tern colony on East Sand Island, we also were involved in distributing or deploying Caspian tern nest dissuasion materials. And the idea here is to, by putting up rope stakes and flagging, to prevent Caspian terns from occupying habitat that they might otherwise want to try and colonize and use for nesting habitat on the upper part of the beach of East Sand Island. So there was widespread use of this passive, what we call passive nest dissuasion technique of rope stakes and flagging on East Sand Island this past season, along with previous years. This shows you a fair amount of passive dissuasion, rope stakes, and flagging right adjacent to the 1 acre of habitat here, which is below the observation blind here. So this was deployed a lot around the colony and also on the upper part of the beach. And then in addition to that, the slide's been cut off so you can't see the text, but we walked the shoreline of East Sand Island periodically, sometimes as frequently as once every hour or two, in order to dissuade by hazing Caspian terns that were occupying the upper part of the beach and starting to prospect for nest sites. So the combination of passive and active dissuasion was what was used to prevent, or try to prevent, Caspian terns from nesting outside the 1 acre area. So this is a vertical aerial image of the east end of East Sand Island. Here in red is the outline of the 1 acre area that the terns were allowed to use as nesting habitat. But you can see that there's quite a bit of bare ground beach, particularly in the upper part of the beach, on this eastern and southern part of the east end of the island. And those areas of potential Caspian tern nesting habitat had passive dissuasion, rope stakes and flagging deployed on them pre-season. A total of 1.74 acres of passive dissuasion was deployed this year prior to the arrival of terns on the breeding colony. But in addition to that, as the breeding season progressed and more sand accreted on the east end of East Sand Island, additional nesting or additional passive dissuasion needed to be deployed in order to prevent Caspian terns from occupying the upper beach habitat that was being built up through accretion during the spring and early summer. So an additional over 1 acre of passive dissuasion was deployed mid-season as supplemental to the initial pre-season passive dissuasion. So this worked out fairly well, except in one part of the east end of East Sand Island, and that part was right adjacent to the 1 acre Caspian tern nesting habitat, which you see here with the observation blinds around it. And just below this short bluff on the south end of the 1 acre colony area is upper beach that the birds were very attracted to nesting in because it was so close to the main colony area. So once the main colony filled up with breeding pairs, roughly 5,000 pairs, additional birds that had not found a site to nest on the 1 acre area occupied these areas below the main colony area. So passive dissuasion was deployed pre-season all the way down to this orange line, but then it had to be removed back to this yellow line because it was getting washed away by spring tide series that were coming up to the 9-foot plus tide series or even higher. And down here you see an area of upper beach that was used a lot by prospecting Caspian terns where supplemental dissuasion material had to be deployed in order to prevent terns from nesting there. Well, the problem with doing this supplemental passive dissuasion deployment, is that that there were areas where we could not dissuade, we couldn't haze Caspian terns that were prospecting and starting to nest because they were so close to the main colony that we would flush the birds that were nesting on the main colony. So in these areas inaccessible to us for hazing Caspian terns because of their proximity to the main colony, we had to use other approaches such as green lasers to dissuade birds like these ones in here from nesting at the upper part of the beach. So I think I have time to talk about some of the other aspects of our monitoring of the Caspian tern colony on East Sand Island. I mentioned earlier that in 2017, Caspian tern nesting success on East Sand Island was 0, that no young were produced during that breeding season on East Sand Island. Over here on the y-axis is the number of young raised per breeding pair on average, running all the way from 0 up to nearly 1.5 young raised per breeding pair. So that lack of any productivity on East Sand Island was in 2017 was not the first time we'd seen that. Back in 2011, we also saw 0 productivity. But you can see that in 2018, there was some nesting success, although it was quite low, the 3rd lowest nesting success on average for the tern colony in years when it didn't fail completely, but about 0.17 young per breeding pair on average were raised on the East Sand Island colony in 2018. So colony attendance is one of the things that we monitor in order to get a sense of how birds are faring on the colony. Usually when nest initiation on the colony is delayed or late relative to the average, this black line here shows you the pre-management average for colony attendance by Caspian terns on East Sand Island as a function of date of the year. And you can see that in 2018, these brown bars here, the initiation of colony attendance was quite delayed compared to the pre-management average, and gradually, much more slowly increased to a peak that was much less than the average pre-management, and then gradually declined at a much lower rate than pre-management. So the birds are basically arriving later. They're spending a lot more time attempting to nest. We know from other data that some breeding pairs are attempting to nest over and over and over again, as many as 4 times in one breeding season. But then by late August or early September, most of the birds that have not nested successfully are giving up. Well, you might wonder why the birds on East Sand Island failed completely in 2011 and in 2017, and didn't do very well in 2018 as well. And this shows you one of the factors involved in those colony collapses, as we call them, when there's no young raised. And this is the number of colony disturbances by bald eagles per day on the y-axis. So from 0 up to 16 major bald eagle disturbances to the tern colony. And by that I mean if the eagle would flush most, if not all, of the Caspian terns that were on the tern colony. And in brown here, in green here, you can see the incidence of eagle disturbances to the colony in 2017, and you can see it was fairly high in late April and much of May, but it peaked out in mid to late June. And this coincided with the collapse of the tern colony, and actually not only the loss of all eggs and chicks that were on the colony at that time in 2017, but also the birds totally abandoned the 1 acre colony area, and many of them left the estuary altogether. Contrast that with eagle disturbance in brown here for 2018. You can see it was very intense early in the season, probably causing the delay in the onset of nesting that we saw on the previous slide, and then it gradually declined until it was quite low at the time when the colony was abandoned and failed in 2017. And we think that this movement or this lack of interest in the Caspian tern colony by bald eagles in June relative to 2017 was what allowed some Caspian terns to raise young successfully in 2018. While we know from previous work that a lot of the reason that eagles pay more or less attention to the Caspian tern colony as a food source has to do with river discharge. And in short, the higher the river discharge, the more eagles seem to be interested in the tern colony as a source of food, presumably because high river discharge limits the eagles' access to alternative food supplies. So this black line here is the average river discharge. This is in the lower Columbia River estuary near Cathlamet is where the river gauge is that USGS operates. And you can see the black line is the average for an extended period of time shown here, and that in 20 the legend isn't here, so I'm going to have to make this up. But in 2011, this orange line here shows, the yellow line shows the discharge in 2011, which was the year when the colony completely failed. And then this orange line here shows discharge, river discharge in 2017, another year when the colony completely failed. And here in red is 2018, this past season, and you can see that even though it was below the average for much of the later part of the breeding season, that in May it was well above average, almost reaching the maximum river discharge that we saw in 2011 and 2017, the 2 years when the Caspian tern colony completely failed. So things were rough for the tern colony early in the season, but they got better, and that we think was, at least in terms of river discharge, and that we think is the main reason that the terns were able to raise some young. And then I'm just going to show you some diet data for the Caspian terns nesting on East Sand Island. This is a function of date on the x-axis, and this is percent of prey items on the y-axis. And we're showing that for salmonids. So these are all juvenile salmonids lumped together. For northern anchovy, for clupeids, mostly juvenile herring, and for surf perch, a sort of ubiquitous estuarine forage fish species. So you can see that in 2018, these brown bars here, that in general, salmonid consumption, or the proportion of salmonids in the diet, was higher than the long-term average, which is the black line here, particularly in late and mid-June, when the birds had a really tough time in 2017. But notice that for anchovies, the 2018 data are much lower than the average, which generally increases throughout the breeding season. But in 2018, it actually reached a peak well before the end of the breeding season. Clupeids took up some of that slack. You can see that they were well above the long-term average, but surf perch were pretty much where they have been on average for the last decade and a half. So some quick conclusions on colony size. There are about 5,000 breeding pairs of Caspian terns on the 1 acre of habitat that was provided for them on East Sand Island in 2018. Tern nesting density averaged 1.23 nests per meter squared. That's significantly higher than we saw in 2017, but significantly lower than we saw in 2016 when it was 1.36 nests per square meter. And then finally, colony size in 2018 was about 60% greater than NOAA's management goal of 3,125 breeding pairs for the East Sand Island Caspian tern colony. So conclusion for nest dissuasion, a total of 3.8, a little over 3.8 acres of passive dissuasion was installed on East Sand Island in 2018 to prevent Caspian terns from nesting outside of the 1 acre designated area. Active hazing was conducted and supplemental dissuasion materials were deployed mid-season to deter terns from nesting outside of the designated area. And although Caspian terns laid at least 84 eggs outside of the designated 1 acre colony area, the combination of active and passive dissuasion were effective in preventing satellite colonies from forming on East Sand Island in 2018. So the dissuasion effort was a success. However, erosion along the southern edge of the designated colony area made passive and active dissuasion on the South Beach much more of a challenge than it has been in most years. So that is going to, I think, remain a challenge in future years for managers. Okay, and in terms of limits to colony size and nesting success, unlike 2017, the tern colony on East Sand Island did not completely fail in 2018, but nesting success was quite low. Tern nest initiation was delayed, and bald eagle disturbance to nesting terns was quite intense early in the season, particularly in May. Columbia River discharge was very high this past season during May, which probably accounts for the interest that bald eagles had in the tern colony as a food source. And that high river discharge was associated with reduced availability of marine forage fish in the estuary, particularly early in the breeding season when most of their diet consisted of out-migrating juvenile salmonids. So a lot of folks to thank here. I think I'm running out of time though, but co-authors were critical for putting this together, funding from Bonneville, Power Administration, Steve Gagnon and John Skidmore, a whole bunch of cooperators that made this work possible. And if there's time, I will try and answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Time for maybe one
quick question. All right.
All right.
Thank you.